Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin through the lens of the US dollar currency index and inflation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. That sale will end on July 13th. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, the reason we're talking about inflation is, well, it's a hot topic for sure, but we are going to get more data on July 13th, in fact, in just 3 days or so. Well, I guess by the time you're watching this video, it might only be 2 days away. But in 2 to 3 days, we're going to have more inflation data. And the thing that I really want to talk about is how this all relates back to the Fed. And we've talked about this a lot on this channel. We do the DCA live that we do every Friday. But I wanted to just sort of reiterate my thoughts, okay? I'm sort of under the assumption that the Fed's not going to pivot anytime soon, right? And the reason is because inflation is still sky high, okay? So I think there is this sort of this school of thought that says, well, the Fed will be forced to pivot like next month or in 2 months because that's what they usually do. But see, usually over at least over the last 10 years was during a period where inflation was reasonably under control. Okay. The issue this time is that inflation is on par with where it was back in the 70s and early 80s. And when you have something like this, I think, even though I wasn't around in the 70s, but I think that the Fed is going to stick to their guns here and they're going to remain hawkish until inflation starts to come back down. Now, the reason why this is important is because it's where inflation peaks usually is where the S&P bottoms. And I made a whole video on that a week or two ago, okay? And if you again, I shouldn't just make these statements because not everyone necessarily watches all these videos. Perhaps what I should do is just pull up the chart and so that we can actually verify this rather than just sort of saying something and hoping you believe it. So why don't I pin this to a new scale and let me switch. I don't need that one on log. I want this one on log. Sorry. Let's change this to log. And you can see again, it was where in the 70s, it was where in that first run on inflation, where inflation started to go sky high, it was where inflation peaked that the S&P bottomed. Okay? And we also saw something like that in the 40s as well. That first surge on inflation, that's where the S&P bottomed. Okay? So the reason why this is important is because we know that whether we like it or not, right, Bitcoin acts as a risk asset. And it's even, in terms of volatility, it seems like it's even riskier than equities. Now, in terms of, it is risky, of course, but I know a lot of us sort of see the long-term vision for Bitcoin, but there will be a lot of downside volatility during equity bear markets, and that's what we're currently experiencing. So the reason why this is important is because it's not until inflation peaks that the S&P will likely bottom. Okay, so remember that when inflation peaks, there's a good chance we're looking at least a local bottom on the S&P 500. Reason why we're talking about this week is because, in fact, there's going to be more data released on July 13th. And consensus is 8.8%, which is higher than it was last month. Okay, last month it was 8.3. It ended up being 8.6. You can go look at it on the chart over here, right? You can see it was 8.6% year over year. All right. So last month consensus was 8.3, ended up being 8.6. This time consensus is 8.8. So it kind of begs the question, well, what is it actually going to be? Is it going to be 9% or is it going to be less than 8.8? If it comes back down, then you could argue that the Fed will take note of that. I still think they're going to raise at least 50 basis points this month, maybe even 75 basis points. I think there's probably even a higher probability they'll do 75 basis points again than 50 basis points. But I don't really know. I'm looking at this and saying, if we get data that's at least 8.8% or even higher, 8.9, 9%. It's just gonna put the pressure on the Fed even more to say they still need to raise interest rates. Now it sort of brings up the point of, well, maybe the Fed can't do anything about this inflation. If it's a supply chain issue, they're not necessarily going to be able to solve it. But what they could do, I suppose, is they're just simply trying to reduce demand. Okay, so they certainly can't fix the supply side of things. They're trying to fix the demand side of things by just raising rates and causing demand to ultimately slow, and therefore that should theoretically be reflected in future prices, right? Where if the demand's not high, the prices will not continue to appreciate quite as much. But I look at this and I say, all right, well, I'm watching inflation closely, okay, and it still seems like it's in an uptrend right now, and even consensus is 8.8. If it does continue to go higher, then there simply is no reason to necessarily assume the bottom is in on the stock market. And if the bottom's not in on the stock market, then I think it's still reasonable to assume that the S&P could still have, or sorry, if the bottom is not in the S&P, then I think it's reasonable to assume that the Bitcoin is still in the midst of its bear market. So this is sort of the way that I'm looking at these markets right now, and thinking about how inflation and the Fed and how it all relates back to Bitcoin through the lens of the stock market and where that's likely going to bottom. And then furthermore, I always go back to the US dollar because I mean, we've talked about this a lot. I do think the US dollar is going to continue in its bull market. I don't really see any clear signs of it slowing. I know there were some people that were hoping it was going to stop over here. But I think it's ultimately gonna make a run much higher, and potentially even up to 115, 116 over the next several months. So I look at things like this. One thing that's interesting, actually, if you overlay this pattern of the U.S. dollar currency index from 2014 over here, if I put the bottom right there, you can kind of see that it would have actually gone up to about 113 or so. If you sort of stretch to the sideways, you can kind of see that that's more or less the path we've been on, and that would actually have us hitting 113, 114 by next month, actually, if it were to continue to follow that pattern. But we also know that when the dollar is in a bull market like it is, and even put in a double bottom in 2021, this was one of the reasons that we said in 2021 that Bitcoin will likely not hit 100K, is because, in fact, we're likely looking at a potential bottom here on the US dollar currency index. I was hoping we would eventually hit 100K by 2023, but I don't think that is a likely scenario at this point. I think it's going to take longer, considering how risk-off markets are in fact going. So I look at this and I say, you know what, the dollar has, I mean, it looks like it's hit a nice double bottom over here. This was the end of the 2017 bull market. This was the end of the early 2021 bull market. It's now in a fairly nice bull market. The dollar is in a nice bull market. And if you actually compare this to Bitcoin, and we put Bitcoin on its own scale, and even then flip that over to a log scale, you can see normally when you see Bitcoin going down, that's when the dollar's going up. And when the dollar's going down, that's when Bitcoin's going up. But right now, the dollar's going up and Bitcoin's going down. Okay, so as long as the dollar remains in this macro bull trend, bull market, I think it's safe to assume that the Bitcoin's going to remain under some sell pressure here, and not just Bitcoin, but in general risk assets. Okay, so the main point of all of this is to say, look, we have inflation data coming this week, and it's likely going to be higher than it was last month, and therefore, right, when we look at it year over year, we're likely going to look at this and say, well, inflation hasn't necessarily peaked. If that's the case, then the S&P, a good chance it hasn't necessarily bottomed. And if that's the case, there's a good chance Bitcoin is still, in fact, in a bear market. So I hope this is useful. Let me know what you guys think about it in the comments below. Remember to subscribe to Into the Cryptoverse Premium, again, at intothecryptoverse.com. That sale is going to end on July 13th. All right, guys, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.